the Department of Management, and I'm very pleased to welcome John Roberts from Stanford University, who's visiting the department this year, his academic year, and who's very kindly agreed to give this public lecture. As some of you will know, John's done an enormous amount of work on management and organisational design and performance. He's got a very important book in 2004, Oxford University Press book on the modern firm, for example. And more recently, he's been doing, along with some other people, some of them at LSE, work essentially on management quality and understanding how to measure the management quality, quality of management. And what he's going to do today is report on part of that work. I'm sure we'll give us much more detail on that, but particularly the part that concerns India. So, with no more ado, I think I'd like to welcome John. He'll talk for, I'm quite sure, sort of maybe 40, 45 minutes, something like that, maybe a little bit more. And then we'll take questions and we'll have a discussion after that. John?
Thank you very much, Saul. Can people hear me okay? I'm not sure if the microphone's working or not. But, anyway, though we're sort of going to run this as I talk and you talk. If you have clarifying questions along the way, if something confuses you, it's not that you disagree with it, but you're confused by it, please stick up your hand and let me know, and I probably won't ignore you. Okay, so this is my title slide, and the talk is based on a paper that's available on Nick Bloom's website at Stanford. Nick is kind of though the authors are listed alphabetically, Nick is really the senior person on this, though not in age, but in contribution. But as you can see, there are three of us from Stanford, one from the second-rate school across the bay, and one from the World Bank. And we're a team working on this question. So business people are pretty convinced, especially managers, that management matters. And most business scholars are convinced of that as well. Economists are not, at least ones who work in economics departments as opposed to management schools. Those of us in management schools have a vested interest in believing that what we're doing is worthwhile. But economists typically have questioned this. Now, you can go all the way back into the 140 years ago and you find economists writing about management and its importance. But really, there's very little in the current economics literature where management figures in. There's Bob Lucas's model of the size structure of firms, the size distribution of firms, where there's something that managers have that differentiates them, and better managers get to manage bigger companies at equilibrium. And Sherwin-Rosen built on those ideas, but a lot of economists really are kind of dubious. And part of it has been that it's very hard to figure out how you measure management, especially if you think of it in terms of the terms that we now more often apply to leadership. But in recent years, work that's been done initially here at the LSE and continues to be centered here at the LSE has been looking into ways of measuring management. And particularly Nick Bloom with his co-author John Van Reenen, who's head of the Center for Economic Performance here, have done surveys of firms, double-blind surveys, so the interviewers don't know anything about the firm either, and so aren't biased, investigating particularly their target centering, their monitoring, and the way they give incentives. And this is, they have 18 measures that were initially developed by McKinsey, and they've examined them all over the world. And they find huge differences within countries and significant differences across countries in what they call the quality of management. And they are sort of entitled to call it quality of management because their measures really do correlate very well with all kinds of measures of performance. Productivity per worker, Tobin's Q for publicly traded companies, profitability, all kinds of things. But this is correlations. And there are lots of correlations on a more micro-specialized level. For example, the work of my colleague Catherine Shaw and Casey Ikniowski, who've examined the productivity of every steel finishing line in North America and discovered that there's a very strong correlation between modern HR methods and productivity. But correlation isn't causality. Maybe good firms can afford to hire good managers. Or maybe it's good firms have good technology and they look well managed as a result. So there's been, in recent couple of years, there's been a little bit of work in the development area with not micro enterprises, nano enterprises. Little 1- and 2-person firms, mostly in India, but also in Mexico and whatnot, teaching their owners the very fundamentals of business, like it's a good idea not to intermix your accounts and the business accounts, or what's the credit and what's a debit, and which goes by the window and which by the door, and which is the window and which is the door. And those turn out to have some important impacts, but they're not really about significant sized firms. And there's really been no work in big firms that would establish causation. There's lots of knowledge through the management literature of good management matters in a correlation fashion, but no, as far as we know, nothing experimental. So one of the findings of Bloom-Van-Reenen is that rich countries have better management. I don't know, can you people read that in the back, the ones of you who are not into your apples? So at the top is the US. The average US management score is about 3.4 on a scale from 1 to 5. And then Germany's next, Sweden, Japan, Canada, France. You can see there's a pretty strong correlation between GDP per capita and this quality of management. And you get down into the developing countries, Brazil, India, China, and lo and behold, Greece, bring up the bottom of the pack. And these are really, they are statistically massively significant. And what it turns out is that it's as if the distribution of management quality were shifted from the poor countries to the rich countries. Poor countries have, let me get over it. So what we have here is U.S. manufacturing and India, and good. Oops. This is as weak as my chair that broke down on the way over. There are some very well managed Indian firms, no question about it. If you look at a typical Tata operation, or anything that Reliance Industries does, or any of the multinationals operating in India, they are very well managed. There are a lot more relatively well managed firms in the US, and correspondingly, there are not many disastrously badly managed firms in the US, down below 2, whereas there's a lot in India. So basically the difference is that India has this thick tail of really execrably managed firms. So, or at least that's what it appears. So the first question is, are we really seeing bad management? A lot of Chicago economists would tend to argue, well, what we're seeing is that firms, of course, are always perfectly profit maximizing. So if they choose not to do these things, it must be that in the Indian context it isn't worthwhile. And some extreme exponents of the contingency view in or behavior would take approximately the same position. So is it really bad management, or are we just observing people making rational choices in a different environment than we're operating in normally? If it is bad management, why are they so badly managed? Okay. There are well-managed Indian firms. Why are they bad? And if they're so bad, how do they survive? Why don't they go out of business? Why don't they get killed off by the competition? Can their management be improved? And if so, to what effect? So that's what we set out to do. And we set up an experiment. We hired a consulting company through open bidding, an international, well-regarded consulting company, has about 60,000 employees in India alone. And we identified large weaving firms around Mumbai, average of 300 or so employees, none fewer than 100, none over about 600, because if they were too big, they were likely to be multinationals and well-run, and if they were too small, they really didn't face the management problems that you get once you get a couple hundred employees. The firms average about 7.5 million a year in turnover. They're all family-owned, and I'll describe them in more detail later. We divided them into two crucial groups and a third group. There was a treatment group who got a lot of consulting help, and a control group who only got a little bit of consulting help. We hadn't intended to give them any, but it turned out they weren't gathering any of the data we needed, so the consultants spent a month persuading them and teaching them how to gather the data, and then gave them some recommendations based on that. And we went back and did historical data from before we showed up in 2008. So we go back 6 or 7 months before our showing up then. And we've collected performance data and data on management practices for the last couple of years. Professor Van Rienen's about to hear this talk for the third time. It's no wonder he came late. The results. Total factor productivity went up about 11%. That's on the order of a couple of years of productivity growth in the economy. And for these firms, it's light years of change. Profits on average rose about $250,000 per firm. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty about what that is in percentage terms. We figured this out just from, figuring out what their cost savings were and how much more they produced and what they sold it for. But these firms, like many Indian firms, we didn't have any good financial data on them. We asked for it, and they laughed. They said, do you want the books we show to the bank, or the books we show to the tax man, or the real ones which are here? And we said, we give up. So we don't have good financial information, so I can't tell you how much this is in profitability. We have one publicly traded company, even though it's dominated by a single shareholder, who's the managing director. They're earning about 5% on sales. So 5% on sales puts 7.5 million sales, puts this on the order of 100% improvement in profit, which is not bad. And quality problems decreased by about 60%. What's more, they started delegating and decentralizing more. They've had big increases in recent months in the communication and a lot more use of IT, though that last point We got some money from somebody to measure the IT, but it's hardly surprising because the consultants pushed them to use IT. So then the question is, why were they so bad? And the basic answer is they just didn't know that they were bad and what they could do better. They had never heard of various practices, or if they'd heard of them, they misestimated their applicability and their profitability. This is pretty amazing when you see what these practices are. They also have pretty weak top management. Top management comes only from the family. They have no trust of their hired managers. And what's more, they only get to draw on the family for top managers. So if you don't have any good managers in the family, you don't have good management. And then competition has been ineffective in driving out badly managed firms, both because of traditional entry barriers and because of the managerial limits on expansion. That the size of the family limits the size of the firm. What might be done? Improve the rule of law. We'll talk about why that would help. Some basic management training would help. Technology transfer from better managed firms would help. So let me show you some pictures. You've listened to me long enough. I can see your eyes clouding over. So these are big companies. Okay? These are substantial operations. These are 4 different plants. And there are 4 stages in production of cotton fabric. First of all, you wind the upper left, you wind yarn onto what's called a warp beam. And then you draw that out and mount it on a loom where the warp beam provides the vertical threads, and then the loom puts horizontal threads in like this. And it may have patterns put in it, things like that. But and then you do inspection and repair. This is a technology that fundamentally hasn't changed since the 1860s. The machines are run with different power, different speeds, but the technology is the same. Now, these plants were a mess. This is a picture of garbage and spare parts and who knows what just stacked up outside the plant. India has the same health, safety, and environmental laws as the UK or EU or US. They just aren't enforced. This is garbage inside a plant. This is flammable garbage inside a plant. Just junk all over. Chemicals in open containers and this guy about to step backwards into them. Can people see these pictures to see? Okay, good. The work areas were a mess too. This is a little harder to see, but let me come over and point at things. So these are the looms. This thing in here is a warp beam, an empty warp beam. It's just lying there in the middle of the plant to get in the way. This desk and chairs are in the middle of the aisle. This is a piece of testing equipment that was brought in to do something and then just left there. I don't know if you can see them here, but there are tools all over the floor. The repairmen have been in there and worked on the looms and then just left the stuff there on the floor. This is worse than my office. This is a piece of machinery covered several inches deep in lint that's held in place by grease. That's a fire hazard and very minimal. This is inventory in one of the plants. Now, the inventory here is raw materials. It's thread. And the thread comes in big bags. And this is leftover threads. And they're just lying there on the floor. They are unsorted. They are unlabeled. And what's more, they're unprotected from the damp. And it's damp around Mumbai. This stuff is rotting. They don't know what's there. Here it's a little more organized, it's stacked vertically. But there's not the slightest chance of, even if that guy there who's supposed to know what's in the storeroom knows, there's no way he's going to get anything out of the bottom there. So there's large amounts of inventory just going to waste. This is inventory that's just randomly thrown together and damaged and just lying there. These are spare parts. They're lying there in the sun and the rain, unsorted, unprotected. This is another spare parts room and a storeroom. The sad thing is these firms appear typical. If you do the Bloom Van Reenen survey on our Indian firms, that's the top distribution, the mean is 2.6. The second distribution is all Indian textile firms in the Bloom Van Reenen sample, mean 2.6. This is all of Indian manufacturing as a whole, mean 2.7. And this is Brazilian and Chinese manufacturing at the bottom, mean just under 2.7. So these firms are disastrous, but they are not unrepresentative. So here's the agenda for the rest of the talk. Talk a bit about management practices before and after. Talk about the effects on performance and on decentralization, communication, and IT. And then talk about the big question, why were things like this? And I think I'll run quickly through the first three items. So here's the experimental design. Tarapur is a village outside of Mumbai. It's a concentration of the industry. There are 66 firms there in our size range. We contacted them and offered them free consulting by Accenture, paid for by Stanford and the World Bank. We wanted to pay for it so that we could call the shots. We thought if they were paying, they might want to spend the consultants' time on marketing things that would spoil our study. 17 firms accepted. About half expressed some interest, but then weren't willing to commit the time that we insisted they put in. Those 17 firms have 28 plants, and we assigned them to 4 groups. We did a first treatment wave where we were giving them the full consulting, and it was manpower limitations that led us to do them in waves. We did a second treatment wave, we did a control wave, and then there were 8 plants where we didn't collect performance data and we didn't send in the consultants with any consulting help, but we did collect data on their management practices to see to what extent there was spillover within the firm from one plant to another. Treatment and control both got a month of what consultants call diagnostics, looking at what's going on, followed by recommendations as to how to get better. Treatment plants got 4 months of help with getting better, average of 2.5 days of consultant time a week. And they collect performance and management practice data weekly. We actually have performance data on a daily basis, but it just puts too much noise in things, so we do it on a weekly basis. But basically, we have no measurement error on these variables because the people are actually there recording what's going on. So I mentioned this. The intervention involved a list of 38 management practices that Accenture developed, and they're focused mostly on operations, quality control, and inventory, to a lesser extent on planning, HR, and coordinating sales and orders with operations. They're very simple things. The first question is, do you do preventative maintenance on your machines? Or do you just wait for them to break down? Okay? So do you change the oil in your car? Or do you wait for the engine to fall out on the road? Well, many of them did preventative maintenance, but it was a yes-no answer. The next question was, do you do it to the manufacturer's recommended standards? Well, many fewer did that. Is downtime recorded on your machines? Do you know why the machines break down? Do you analyze that information to prevent it from happening again? And you could answer yes to the first and yes to the second and no to the third, and you'd be very typical. Inventory. Do you record the purchases and use of inventory? Do you monitor stocks more frequently than yearly? Do you take them weekly? So here's a graph of the adoption. So in the middle of the screen is the end of the diagnostic phase, when we give them the recommendations. There are 3 lines here. The bottom red one is the off-site plants, the ones that didn't get any management and consulting help. The second line, which starts out higher and rises, but more than the bottom and less than the top, those are the control firms. They're actually better at the start because by far the best managed firm in our sample happens to be one of the control firms. There's a guy who had actually gone out and studied Japanese lean manufacturing and implemented it in his company, and so he pulls the average up significantly. The average was about a 2.6 on this score. Well, no, it's 0.26 of the 38 practices was the average. He came in at about 0.5 or 6, and that pulled up the average. What you see is that the top line, the treatment of plants, very quickly adopt a fair number of practices and then continue for a while. Now, we don't know what will happen when the consultants go away next month, but we're going back in a year to see what's happened. The control firms did implement some non-trivial changes, but they weren't nearly as successful in implementing them as the ones that got help. And the off-site firms, after some lag, started introducing the changes too. Largely, we presume, from the managing directors telling the plant managers in the off-site plants about what's going on. Go talk to Suresh over in the other plant. Beforehand, 20% of the people in the staff were working in repair. So 20% of the staff, 20% of their labor costs are for repairing defective fabric. And they were, even after that, they had to scrap 5% of it. But anything that needed repairing was marked down from quality A to quality B to quality C, and you got much lower prices for B and C than for A. So improving quality made a big difference. Quality record keeping, this is a journal that one of the companies kept about quality problems, but the only reason they kept it was in case a customer came back complaining about quality and wanting a rebate, they'd have some record of what actually happened. They never used this data in any way in managing the company. They now have it very much ordered. It feeds into computer systems. It's totally different. And the quality data is analyzed at daily meetings of the plant manager and his direct reports. This never happened before. And here's one of the big pictures. There's 6 lines here, but the fat ones are the interesting ones. This is an index of quality defects weighted by the seriousness of the defect. And they're normalized to be this, the black line is the treatment plants, the red line is the control plants. And in the period before the diagnostic, they're both, at the end of the diagnostic, they're normalized to be the same. Okay, so 100 is where they both start. And then the quality problems in the treatment plants fall from 100 to down around 20, somewhere in there. And there's basically no change in the control plants. So that suggests a huge increase in quality that is attributable to the intervention. And I'm going to just skip over the econometrics, but this is estimates of the impact of management practices on quality. You see 3 stars there. That means it's a good result. Inventory now is racked and labeled and protected, and they have these cards that have urine samples on them that they provide to the salespeople, so the salespeople can push to have order things, sell things that can be made with the existing inventory, rather than it just rotting away. And here's the same sort of picture. Black line is the treatment effect, red line is the control plants, normalized at the end of the diagnostic period to be the same. And you can see that inventory falls substantially in the treatment plants from 100 to down under 80 before it starts up. Both of them are going up in the later periods there because of seasonal patterns in production and thus in inventory. By the way, the dotted lines represent 95th percentiles. So the 95% confidence interval around this estimate is between the 2 dotted red lines. And you can see they barely overlap. And more 3 stars. In production, they started doing, all sorts of things that Japan started 40 years ago, and the US took 20 years plus years to learn. And these guys are now learning, so things like 5X, or when something goes wrong with your machine, you put a tag on it so the repair people know to come around and do something about it, and they're responsible. If the tag's still there tomorrow, they're in trouble. Organizing the spares, supplies, doing proper maintenance, posting performance of individual machines on a board where it's visible to everyone and that you can get the social pressure going if that works, and then giving incentive pay to the weavers based on that. And more 3 stars. It's not nearly as dramatic in the numbers. That's why we don't have the pictures, but we got more output. One of the things that John and Nick and what's Sadden's first name? Raphael, who's now at HBS, who's a recent LSE PhD, have done a paper looking at management around the world and have found that developing country firms are typically very centralized with very little delegation. And it seems that a major reason for that is that the owners are terrified that if they give any power to the non-family member managers, they'll embezzle everything in sight. And and that's a worry. That could be a worry anywhere. But if it takes forever to get a law case through, as it does in India, and if your management systems are very poor, so it's hard to detect fraud, it's a much bigger worry. So if you got better management systems, you ought to be able to detect theft more easily. Therefore, you can trust people because you can check up on them. and you ought to see more decentralization. And that's very important, because one of the things we've found in this is that the firms don't grow on the basis of their productivity. They grow on the basis of having family members to run a new plant. So there's an optimal size plant. All these plants are basically the same size, so we assume that's the right size. So if a firm gets bigger by adding plants, but you have to have brothers whom you can trust to do that. And so if you look at the correlation between quality of management and size of the firm in our data, it's about 0.2. If you look at the correlation between number of male adult family members and size of the firm, it's over 0.6. So being able to trust outsiders ought to allow the better managed firms to expand where they haven't been able to before. I mentioned, so here's a plot of decentralization and changes in management practices, and the firms that have changed practices more have decentralized a lot more. That went the wrong way. Okay. There's also a significant increase in the use of computers, the number of people, not just the number of people sitting at computers a day, but number of people using reports generated by computers, data and so on. There's a lot more communication between the managing director, who's typically in an office in Mumbai, and before the only person he spoke to was the plant manager. And now the guy who's head of quality or the head of purchasing and head of manufacturing, those people are talking to the managing directors. And that seems to be a significant change. There's also more communication among those first level people and much more open discussion. Now, I won't get into this last point, but it seems there's some cultural change going on here. And that has some questions, raises some questions about just what it is we're estimating, whether we're estimating the impact of changing practices or the impact of the total intervention, including the change in culture. So then, why weren't they doing this already? Well, we built a decision model, big, branch here, branch there, question yes, go this way, no, go this way. We show that to business audiences. We don't show it to economists. They're just mystified by the whole process. But you then ask them to use their knowledge, their observations, the results of their discussions to categorize in various pots why it was that a particular practice had not been adopted. And initially, only a little more than a quarter of the practices have been adopted across the firms. Of those, 40% of the 73%, 4/7 of them were because of ignorance of the practice. Somehow no one had ever told them that doing preventative maintenance according to the manufacturer's specifications might be a profitable thing to do, rather than just costly. Or no one had ever told them about keeping track of inventories and things like that. Or they had not tried paying performance pay even to the weavers, who many shifted to piece rate. Another 30 out of the 3/7 were because they'd heard of them but just didn't really think they applied or that they would work. So yeah, it's like the U.S. auto industry. From the 1970s on, American automobile companies were sending engineers and managers to look at Japanese auto plants. And they didn't believe them. They didn't believe what they were seeing. Because in a Japanese auto plant, there's no rework area. If it comes off the line, it's ready to go. In a traditional Japanese and American auto plant, a quarter of the space is given over to rework. And the Americans just couldn't believe it. They believed somewhere hidden behind Mount Fuji was a giant rework area. It just wasn't there. They couldn't believe that you could do things that way. And then they didn't believe that if the Japanese could do it that way, the Americans could. Over time, of course, as the practices, what happened is some of the easy, obvious wins were adopted. The managers and owners came to trust the consultants, implemented some more. The reasons for non-adoption shift from ignorance to miscalculation, or the director just doesn't get around to it. These directors are working 72 hours a week, so there's lots of stuff that they can't get around to. Or the line managers don't have the incentives. They're supposed to hold daily meetings, and it's a pain in the butt, so they don't. Why doesn't competition work? Well, at a weaver wage of $5 a day, these companies are profitable, so they're not in danger of going bankrupt. The directors are working their butts off. They don't delegate for fear of embezzlement, and that limits growth. They just can't manage bigger companies than they're managing. And then there's a capital barrier to entry. These companies have about $13 million on average capital stock, capital equipment. And so getting into the business requires that. And there's no guarantee that anybody coming in is going to be any better. So firms in emerging economies often have bad management that limits their productivity. Lack of knowledge is a key reason for this. Such knowledge can be transferred and applied, and the results are big. And this is really important, I think, at a very fundamental level, much more important than establishing to my economics colleagues that management matters. If you go back to the very first slide, should have put it in again. But you get to see all those great pictures. GDP per capita and the quality of management are very closely correlated. And there's reason to believe there's causation there. That badly managed firms are unproductive, and that aggregates up to the national level. If we're going to ever rescue India from poverty, or Brazil, or the other emerging nations, we're going to have to get manufacturing productivity up. Everybody knows about the wonderful things that are happening in Bangalore and in the IT and business process outsourcing industries and whatnot. But those employ at most a couple of million people in India. They leave 600 million still in the villages. And they leave, of course, another 400 million working and living in the slums. China has pulled millions out of poverty by manufacturing. And there's no way that IT is ever going to be a big enough thing to pull India into the world of the developed economies. India is going to have to bring up its manufacturing. And so doing something about the quality of Indian management could really have, I believe, a big impact on economic growth in India and around the world. And that makes it worthwhile to do. So what can we do? I said early on, would be helpful, obviously, if we could facilitate training for senior managers and top executives, but not the kind of stuff that they're going to learn at the Indian business school. It's not a matter of learning, the latest insights into how to manage breakthrough innovation, or how to how to rob your clients blind or any of the other things that we teach. It's about very hands-on, simple stuff that I think any of my colleagues, they just decided it's something to read and take the students to see a well-run plant, and that's as close as our operations people would go to it. But it could have huge impact to have very simple educational stuff. What happens basically management's a technology, and it diffuses slowly, like other technologies. Knowing how to do something, that in that sense, the kind of management I'm talking about here, knowing how to do something and what to do is essentially a technology, a set of knowledge about something. Well, in the developed economies, that technology tends to spread through the work of consultants and through labor market mobility. GM and Ford finally learned how to produce reasonable cars by hiring people who'd worked for Toyota in their American plants, and by listening to Booz Allen and people like that. Neither of those mechanisms seem to be working in India. The people who work in the great Indian companies are not tempted to come and work in these plants. Plant managers or plant foremen or whatever are not coming to these from Reliance Industries to these companies. And the consulting business is, there's lots and lots of Indian consultants, but the price is low and it reflects the quality. Now, in fact, the profits here are big enough that payback period of a couple of years for one of these firms to hire Accenture. But that's something that hasn't been tried as yet. The other thing is to improve the rule of law, so you're not so frightened of your managers embezzling what you've earned. So that's the end of what I had to say. I thank you for your patience and your interest, and I'm delighted to answer any questions that any of you have.
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah, hi. My name's Dermot Bates. I used to lead the emerging market practice of one of the major consulting firms. I might add, not Accenture. This is fascinating. We, together with Dr. Boyle and myself, did masses of work in the former Soviet Union 10, 12 years ago on exactly the same set of issues, with exactly the same set of approaches, maybe several hundred. To your knowledge, has anyone in the academic community actually looked over the course of the last 5 or 6 years as to the results of that work in the former Soviet Union and compared it to what you have here?
Well, I wasn't even aware of it.
Yeah, I think you find it fascinating.
Could you give me the reference?
I think on Wednesday.
On Wednesday.
On Wednesday. Okay.
But it is, it really is quite staggering. I mean, having looked at, if you will, the classic industries that were spun out, textiles, etc., precisely the same set of problems. And just at the end of your lecture, I think you alluded to what is the fundamental problem. And that is, if you look at these businesses in terms of human capital, it's absolutely impossible to tie in free markets the most capable of the managers, because they're bidden away. And without an approach to management that enables those literally on the shop floor, bottom up, to improve and to grow their management skills. Over time, the likelihood is that these businesses will simply either fade away. The only other point I would make, the other thing that's always been in my mind on this is, why haven't we seen much more consolidation in these sectors? And I guess that's got to do with inter-family politics, I guess.
I think it's inter-family politics. These firms, on average, have been in business for 20 years plus.
Yeah.
And some of them are into the second and third generation of family management. I think the unless it was through, through a marriage,
Yeah.
I don't think it would happen.
Great, thanks. That was really wonderful to see.
My name is Sandeep Bansal. Professor Roberts, thank you for the excellent talk.
Thank
The
you.
insights are very, very much appreciated. You know, that was quite a chart you showed initially, the gap between the rich nations and the emerging countries in terms of the quality of management.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping that you can comment on the trends that you're observing. I mean, are you noticing that this gap is diminishing? Are you seeing some genuine improvement in the Southeast economies?
Well, John would know better than I, because the Center for Economic Performance is revisiting many of the firms they interviewed back in '06. And the only data I've seen is from China. And the Chinese textile firms are as bad as the Indian textile firms, and they aren't getting any better. On the other hand, the Chinese electrical and equipment and electronic companies are improving at a staggering rate. So I don't know. That's everything I know about the subject.
I can say, I mean, this is very much work in progress. So we're doing this resurveying now, 2010, of the firms we looked at in 2006, and some was in 2004. And the Chinese firms do appear to have improved over that period, the last 4 or 5 years. So there does seem to be some real improvements in the management policy. I mean, that's the most stunning thing which seems to come out of the initial research. And there's lots of caveats around that, but there does appear to be improvement, much more so than indeed in the Indian firms. It's on average not affected. So we still have to crunch data, but it does look as if there's some catching up going on, albeit not as fast as you might hope.
We have some work planned. I don't know how grand it will turn out to be, but to go look at some Chinese firms in detail, sort of the way we have here, not the same research design, but we have at Stanford, one of the more unusual PhD students in the world. He was the founder and chairman of, I think it's called Sea Travel. It's the largest travel agency in China. Sea-Trip. And he got tired of being a businessman and decided he wanted to become a professor. He'd actually been a math whiz as a child. At age 14, he'd been sent to Fudan University to study mathematics. So he's in our program, and he doesn't seem to need research funding. We actually have him on a fellowship just so we won't differentiate against him. But and he's also planning to do some experiments inside his company with HR policies. So interesting things may happen.
John, I'm fascinated by the research design that you employed here, which is really a massive intervention. You've done an experiment, hiring a consulting company to do consulting to a number of firms for a month or more, and so on. So I'm wondering, how much did this research project cost? You said Stanford paid for it.
No, it's been paid for by a number of sources. So far, we've blown through about 1.3 million US, which is like, close to £1 million. And getting closer with every passing day. Stanford put in an initial $350,000. Then Nick has put every penny that he's ever seen into it. I've gotten the business school to put in a couple of $100,000. Then we've gotten money from the CGI, and we've gotten money from the World Bank, and money from Microsoft through Toulouse, and a dribble here and a dribble there. It's very expensive.
And
That's why it's good to have billionaire grad students.
and the hope is, after such a research project, is what, to have a paper?
There is a paper.
Okay. But obviously you have some years in mind.
It's getting close to a book. But somehow the data, the sample size is a little bothersome. But on the other hand, we have, if you think of it in the time series dimension, we've got huge amounts of data. And, but it is one industry. Whether that justifies a book, I don't know, but there's going to be papers.
Thank you very much. A very interesting discussion. Having, as a consultant and author, and having been in Eastern Europe, I mean, these problems you see here are the same as you see in Eastern Europe and China. I mean, it's very interesting to see someone talking about whether management matters. As a consultant, I'm absolutely convinced it does. A few years ago, I came across some data from Australia. Some consultants, agricultural consultants, had calculated the average return over a 20-year period of different agro-business firms. The top companies had 11% return, whereas the average was only 4%. So there's really a big, significant difference. And the question, of course, is what causes some companies in the same environment to perform better over the longer term, better than others? And it's quite clear it's management, because everything else is either the same or it's within the grasp of management to do. And so I agree with you, it's management that's got to be improved in India. It's like management is a catalyst. I don't think it's a technology. It's something that you need to be there. Infantry control and civil, I think, is is a technology. Management is a catalyst. It allows all these things to be implemented and generate value. And the interesting thing is, where do we learn to be managers? Well, we learn here by looking at other people who are good. That's why all these numbers at the top are good, because they've been that draft. Because there are lots of good managers in GM and ICL around, and people learn. They learn by mistake. People encourage people to get managers. In third world countries, of course, there aren't very many. There are a few consultants, they can't afford it. And so I agree with you, we need to pass information to the people at the top so that they are aware of what models exist in their industry. But I'm equally concerned, and I agree with my colleague Dermot, that we need to teach people at the lowest level what it is to be a basic manager. Those basic things that are the principles of a good manager. It so happens I've written a book about it, but actually, and I'd like to start a foundation on that, trying to spread to third world countries in a low-cost program. Perhaps as little as $100 a person, who is trained in being a good manager. So you can take a marketing department and say, this will now be properly managed in a team. And when they've learned, they can go and sell their own lessons elsewhere in the organisation. I think this is the only way we can overcome, which I think is a really tremendous deficit in management that the third world suffers from. And I agree with you, they aren't going to go very well unless we do something about that. Thank you.
We or they.
Yeah.
Did you or your colleagues present these results to the Indian government, and if so, what was their reaction to this?
We have not yet. We did have no. The answer is no.
Hello, it was really very interesting to listen to you, but I was thinking how much actually this bad management and quality issues are down to the collective culture.
How much?
How much actually the influence collective culture has to the management?
Well,
because if we see at the graph, actually, the main of the countries that we see at the top, they're the ones of more individualistic culture. For example, we have Germany, we have USA, and then at the bottom of it, we mainly have the collective cultures. And for example, the fact that most of the majority of businesses in India are run by the family, and the fact that they want to present their face and actually show themselves as reputable members of the business, it's very difficult for them to fire people who are not performing very well. So how much the culture really influences this quality issue?
Okay. So the quick answer is I don't know. The one place that I point out, is that Japan comes fourth on this, and Japan is a relatively collectivist culture, so that's not an immediate thing. And Brazil is a relatively individualistic culture, so it's not a perfect correlation, though certainly you see a pattern here. I mean, there's kind of the Northern Europe, America, Japan, and then Southern Europe, and then the developing countries, and then Greece. I don't know. I really don't know. But this is Van Riemen's numbers. So.
I point out the Greek numbers, of course, were a couple of years ago they came so low. Everyone's laughing at us saying, "Oh, Greece is much better managed than you think." History, we should have been by CBS.
Should have been shorting Greece. Just to continue a bit with the question, though, there's been a lot of discussion back in the 80s about the extent to which the superior Japanese manufacturing management was a function that was only applicable to Japan, and that it was something wrapped up in the Japanese culture. And it turned out absolutely not to be. So that's at least one data point that suggests that it's too easy to make cultural arguments about at least the parts of management that are technical, as opposed, I'm sure that the management style that works in Uzbekistan probably doesn't work so well in Uganda. I'm quite willing to believe there are big cultural differences there, but on the kind of stuff we're doing here, I don't think there's, my guess is it's not a big deal.
Apologies if I missed this. What was the instrument used in the IV regressions?
Oh, just the time since the intervention. So the time since the intervention, we used the instrument for the adoption of management practices. Because the problem with the potential endogeneity is that maybe a firm that realizes it's got lousy quality will act on quality variables, and so you get bias in the stuff.
I'm going to cheat for a second because I want to ask you a question. I've been hoping someone else would ask you, but I think your main answer to why this was going on was ignorance, very high proportion ignorance. But in a way that doesn't get it, because ignorance is about failure of dissemination of knowledge. And I'm quite interested in what you picked up on why there are those failures. And in particular, you mentioned as well that in China, they're not in this sector as it happens, but in China, they have been more successful, presumably, in this dissemination.
In recent years. In the last couple of years.
How?
Don't know.
Having worked in China for a large consulting company, the internet is fantastic, and that the Chinese decided the telecommunication network would be improved by having mobiles, so everyone can get into the internet and everyone speaks English. The people are very characteristically dying to improve, and they picked it up off the internet, in my view.
But I think,
and of course in things like electronic firms, which I think you highlighted as a place where there had been a big change, the demand for those products has been increasing considerably, whereas I guess in textiles the total demand probably wasn't increasing very much.
no, probably not. Part of it is, though, that these guys didn't know they were badly managed. It hadn't occurred to them. Nobody around them was doing anything any better. There's one guy who has a good plant, but they didn't pay much attention to him. They ride on the train from their offices in Delhi up to where the plants are. They presumably chat with each other. There's now, in the last, yesterday I discovered that there's starting to be some leakage from these firms to other firms in the area who hadn't signed up. So they're talking about it, but when they were talking before, they were all doing the same things wrong. And if you're all doing the same thing, it's easy to stay ignorant.
Hi, my name is Regis. I'm a PhD candidate looking at Brazilian Indian firms, and one of the things that struck
Looking at what?
Brazilian and Indian firms,
Oh, okay.
and one of the things that struck me is you mentioned kind of this family focus and SMEs in India, and then noting also this kind of divide between SMEs and large firms in India. But I look at the newspapers and I see the feud with the Ambani brothers and things like that. And so I was curious about your perspective on some of the larger firms in India, if they've been able to converge to advanced country management standards, or if they've just been able to escape a little bit more than these SMEs.
Yeah. I think these guys aren't SMEs. They would be in the top 5% of the size distribution of US firms.
Okay.
So they're big companies. But what you raise is a very interesting point, is how these companies like Reliance and Wipro and Infosys that are in their first or second generation managed to get so big. They clearly had to get over the problem of trusting non-family members. And in fact, it seems that at Reliance you can trust anybody but a family member. And I don't know the answer to that question, and it's one that I think is really an important one to find out, because it's not just India where this is a problem. The need to, or the preference for relying on family members in management is something that's widespread around the world. And in many places, I think it has the same limiting effect on growth, that companies get moderately successful, but they never transition to being real winners. And so understanding how those winners manage to get over that barrier to growth would be a fascinating thing to learn.
Okay, a couple more questions.
Yeah, you mentioned that the consultants are currently still on the site.
Yep.
And that you plan to go back in a year to take measurements again.
Yep.
What are your expectations for these measurements? What do you
Okay.
expect?
So just to be clear, the consultants are just there to encourage them now and to make sure that the data is still flowing. They're not helping them anymore in that sense. My guess is that there will be backsliding, and that there will be less backsliding that much of the backsliding will be around things that either have proven not to be as profitable as they thought initially, or that are a pain in the butt for the plant manager. And there are several of the firms that have introduced performance pay for the plant managers and the next level down, and I expect there to be much less backsliding there, and maybe some further implementation of recommendations that haven't been taken up yet. But I just gave you my economist credo.
Okay, yeah, building on Saul's earlier point about ignorance and failure in dissemination of knowledge. So I was wondering whether the type of supply value chain that the firm is a part of makes a difference. For example, those who produce, well, they are textile firms, textile factories, right? Those who provide fabrics for local government firms versus those who are part of a global production networks where that like global buyers like Nike, like Adidas, they source from. Whether this makes a difference in terms of their position in the knowledge network.
I very much believe it. It very likely does. Some of these firms sell to export, but mostly to the Middle East, not to the United Arab Emirates, part of the Middle East. they're basically selling in the domestic market. Their upstream suppliers are companies like them, and they're selling to people making shirts and upholstery and things like that for the Indian market. We didn't know it, but there when we started. But there's down in South India, there are several clusters of fabric manufacturers that are much better than these guys, and it's fine. We get to help these guys a lot more than we would have been able to help the good ones. But I suspect they may be the ones who are making the cloth that gets sold to suppliers to Nike. Nike, of course, outsources all of its production, but it keeps a pretty close eye on what's going on in the plants of its direct suppliers. So, yeah, I would believe that the supply chain would matter a lot, and I think probably that's another reason why the Chinese electrical equipment and electronic industry is moving much faster than the textile industry, because they're selling into global markets to demanding and sophisticated customers.
Professor, you mentioned ignorance as one of the reasons why they may not have taken on advanced management techniques. Did you also consider if the fact that all these firms were co-located, whether there was some form of a tacit collusion almost, whereby it wasn't in their own incentive to try to compete too hard against some of their peers? Because they're all in the same area, they kind of might know each other.
Yeah.
They don't want to steal from their competitor and kind of get into
we didn't see anything either in our visits or in the reports from the consultants that was an issue. They don't really see themselves as they have different customers, and I don't think any of these companies share a customer. And there's so many companies that these 17 in Tarapur, they're 17 out of 66 there, and there are thousands around India. So I don't think that's likely what's going on. I think they may have all made each other feel good because they all seem to be. One of the things that comes out of John's work is that that 80% of managers believe they are superior to the average manager. These guys could all convince themselves that they were doing great. They're making enough money to send their kids to school in the States, and they've got a good life. They just didn't know that they could be sending them to Stanford.
I'm going to take just one question from Gary and stop.
Would you argue that in the US, Germany, Sweden, and Japan, the quality of management, say 100 years ago, was equivalent to the quality of management that you're observing in India today? And if so, then how did companies in those countries gain the knowledge in order to become better managers?
Well, I don't know. I do know that there was work done on the Indian weaving industry at the start of the 20th century, at which time it was as bad relative to the British weaving industry as it is today, to the extent that there is a British weaving industry. But my guess is that, yeah, they had to learn these things. And, a lot of the stuff that was here was stuff that was developed in Japan in the 60s. And, that wasn't done in mass production plants. Even in the best managed American companies, they had to learn it. And before that, it was before the Japanese quality movement and Kanban and all that. There was the M form of organization, which developed in the U.S. in the period right after the First World War, but didn't spread to Europe until the 50s and 60s when McKinsey came over. I think it's interesting. You can correlate this with GDP per capita. But you can also correlate it with how long McKinsey's been in a given country. And since these are McKinsey measures that we're looking at, but yeah, and scientific management became before that, and there's been advances in management over the since management emerged in the 19th century, and they've had to learn it.
Well, I think we've gone on actually quite a long time, and I think we should thank John for this really excellent presentation. It's made me think that perhaps more to the whole bounded rationality idea of humanity that I thought, idea of but no, it was really very useful, very interesting. So thanks very much indeed.